that and to look at the bigger picture today about cultural resources and its place within California state parks. For comparison, we're going to also kind of visit some other iconic cultural sites beyond the USA and talk a little bit about them and how people are managing those sites as well. So with that, we shall go ahead and begin. Well, shall we go ahead and begin? Okay, here. Now, when I used to teach cultural resources in state parks, I would always start off with a quiz, so it would let me know where the class was in terms of the subject. I'm going to do that again today. So our quiz today is one question, and it's this: 1872, President Ulysses S. Grant signed a bill establishing Yellowstone as the first national park. But a serious proposal for a national park was made previously by A. Abraham Lincoln, B. Thomas Jefferson, C. George Catlin, or D. Frederick Law Olmsted. So think about that a second, and you can put your comments, put your A, B, C, D in the chat, and we'll come back to it. Okay. So off we go here. It was in the midst of a terrible civil war in 1864 that President Abraham Lincoln conferred some 20,000 acres of federal land to the state of California. This included Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove. And although the feds had conferred land to the states before, this transfer was very different because it was for the purpose of public use, resort, and recreation to be held inalienable for all time. So this was the beginning of the formal park movement in the United States with this transfer by Abraham Lincoln. Well, the driving force behind this concept was a man called Frederick Law Olmsted. And in his day, he was the preeminent landscape architect and conservationist in America. He's very famous for design and construction of Central Park in New York City, the Chicago World's Fair and Columbian Exhibition in 1893, Jackson Park, Washington Park, UC Berkeley, Stanford University. He's known for the idea that the enjoyment of nature is necessary for humans to achieve the health and vigor of their intellect. And this was a concept coming out of the notion of the Jeffersonian democracy. That is, that people should have a tie to the land and they should have a familiarity with that as part of their growth and ability to contribute to society. So this was a very important notion in the mind of Frederick Law Olmsted when he proposed this transfer of 20,000 acres to the state of California. Well, Frederick Law Olmsted got another job. Shortly after taking over as chairman of the Yosemite Commission in 1864, he left in 1865 to begin work on Central Park in New York City. But he left others in charge with the goal to preserve scenic and natural resources, make the area accessible to visitors, and because without this program, without this project, the area would remain property of only the rich. So the goal here was to open up a landscape to ordinary people that they could enjoy, they could learn from, they could benefit from. It was a very noble undertaking. Well, after Olmsted departed, the following decades were sadly characterized by neglect and abuse in Yosemite. So much so that by 1890, with the advocacy of John Muir and others, for the creation of a larger Yosemite Forest Reserve under federal management, the 20,000 acres previously conferred to the state of California was withdrawn in favor of the federal management. Um, Now, there were a number of reasons for this neglect and abuse, but one of the principal ones was that the Sierra Miwok and other native Californians had been removed from Yosemite, and their management over that landscape, especially in Yosemite Valley, was discontinued. It became brushy, it was overgrown, it was overgrazed, and it was basically abused. And as one writer uh, reminded us, uninhabited wilderness had to be created before it could be preserved. In other words, the notion that these wilderness landscapes had not been managed by people previous to European or American arrival um, was really a notion that was a fantasy. So, Yosemite, the first park reserve set aside in perpetuity, was returned to federal ownership in 1890. And that's the beginning of the park movement. But really, it wasn't a total bust in California because with the Yosemite acquisition came a whole lot of other early preservation projects that began to appear with different advocacies behind them. A lot of natural resource projects, particularly redwood forest preservation, and a number of early historic site preservation projects as well. Marshall Gold, Sutter's Fort, Monterey Custom House, San Francisco Solano Mission, Fort Ross, La Purísima, Pio Pico, a whole lot of preservation groups were getting together and setting aside, acquiring and setting aside landscapes to ultimately become historic parks. So these advocacies were going directly to the legislature and proposing individual laws which would create a state park here and a state park there. And pretty soon, California state parks, or sorry, the state of California decided that they needed a system and a plan to accommodate all of these individual requests. And they turned to a familiar name to provide that leadership. Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., the son of the master Frederick Law Olmsted, was called upon in 1928 to conduct the first survey of park lands in California. And his studies and his recommendations formed the blueprint for the acquisition and management of the California State Park system that we have today. And he is, in my mind, one of the giants in our field. Well, Frederick Law Olmsted was very bent on including a wide variety of consultations with different people related to the plan for a state park system in California. And one of the most important advisors to him in his 1928 survey of potential state park acquisitions was Dr. Alfred Lewis Kroeber, our friend A.L. Kroeber from UC Berkeley. Olmsted also worked with a lot of other historic preservation advocates, the Sons and Daughters of the Golden West, the California Historical Society, and the Society of Pioneers, Society of California Pioneers, and so on, as well as a lot of natural resource advocates in designing his plan. But for our subject today, cultural resources, his consultation with A.L. Kroeber was particularly important. Kroeber recommended that the new California state park system encompass examples of the major cultural areas of native California. And he pointed out to Olmsted that this complex mosaic of cultures and languages in ancient California is unmatched in North America. Six major language families, over 100 separate languages spoken, separate cultural traditions maintained for centuries, for millennia, in close proximity to neighbors who spoke a different language. And the most complex cultural history in North America, California has that, as well as the most diverse ecosystems of any state in the country. And Kroeber was the one that put these two facts together and alerted Olmsted to the fact that in designing the state park system, he wanted to be sure to include examples from all the major cultural areas in native California. So if you look at this map over here on the right and the inset of it, you will see what Kroeber was talking about. California is unique, having these six different language families in this relatively small area compared to the situation in North America. So you can see most of North America is characterized by vast areas with the same language family dominating. Very, very few areas have a mosaic, and nobody has anything like what we have in California with the six major language families of the seven known in North America. Six of them occur in California, and some of these examples are really extraordinary. So it really is a very important thing. And I believe, I went through the Olmsted papers and read his notes and everything. And I'm sure that Kroeber pointed out to him that the way this could be accomplished, that is, uh, preserving examples of these major cultural areas within a state park system, is to buy good parkland in each one of these areas. Because I'm sure he told Olmsted that when you buy good parkland, you're going to get good cultural history parkland as well as good native resource parkland. So I think that was the secret that Kroeber told to Olmsted, and Olmsted baked that into the system of the plan for the California State Park system that we have and celebrate today. So historic monuments recommended for acquisition in the 1928 Olmsted survey: Columbia, Shasta, Fort Ross, La Purísima, Marshall Park, Marshall Gold Park at Coloma, Donner Lake, Mark Twain, Camillus Ranch, De La Guerra Ranch in Santa Barbara, and the Vallejo home. A good start. Archaeological sites represented, not so many, but still part of the original plan. Painted Rock on the Carrizo Plain, Chumash Painted Cave, stone fish traps on the Salton Sea in Riverside County, the shell mounds of Tulare County, that's near Bakersfield, and Petrified Forest in Sonoma County. A good start. So out of that plan, a number of early historic preservation projects were proposed, um, including in 1895, the official recognition of a historical landmarks program began in Los Angeles under Charles Loomis, and this began to generate a pipeline for which these historic properties could work their way towards the recognition and ultimately the inclusion in the state park system. So this was all happening in the first decade, last decade of the 19th century, first decade of the 20th century. An important milestone in this process was a document created called the Survey of Historic Sites and Landmarks in California. And it was compiled by Aubrey Drury for the 1928 Park Bond Campaign. This report emphasized missions, but it also included among the potential future acquisition targets forts, monuments, ship landings and shipwrecks, buildings, mining towns, literary sites, Indian villages, pictographs, shell mounds, and caves. In other words, a pretty good cross section of the cultural resource inventory that we find today in the California State Park system. So the point here is that some people think that cultural resources were added to the state park system after the fact as an afterthought or something that came out of CEQA or something else. But that's not true. Cultural resources were part of the original design and plan for the state park system. They were an integral part of the concept of parks in California. And this is important to keep in mind when we look at parks today. So it's interesting to kind of turn your attention elsewhere and see what else was happening about the same time. So I put together a few examples of this just to show you kind of what the lay of the land was at the same time that California was beginning to develop its park system. Casa Grande Ruins, if you've been there, it's great. If you haven't been there, you should go there. A 4-story tall caliche adobe construction. It's about 30 miles east of Phoenix or so, built in the 13th century. A fabulous history here, going back to Father Kino in 1694. Anza takes the first measurements of the site of the Great House in 1775. In the 1880s, it was threatened by 19th century tourists. In 1887, philanthropist Mary Hemingway raises funds to protect Casa Grande and support the first professional archaeology there. 1892, protected by President Benjamin Harrison, executive order as the first prehistoric and cultural reserve in the United States. 1918, established as a national monument by President Woodrow Wilson to protect the surrounding Ho complex. And in 1932, a protective cover designed and installed by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. was added and now has become part of the iconic profile of this very, very unique national monument today. So that's an example of what was happening elsewhere. Other examples too. The Great Serpent Mound in Ohio, 1848, it was first described. 1885, saved from destruction by Frederick Ward Putnam of Harvard University. They had a conference in Ohio, and one of the field trips was to this Great Serpent Mound. These people attending the conference were all from the East Coast, and they had a bunch of money in their pocket and everything. And they decided, oh man, who owns this place? And found out it wasn't publicly owned. And they passed the hat, put together the funds, and acquired the property for its preservation. So the surrounding landscape was acquired by the ladies of Boston, and in 1900, the Great Serpent Mound was transferred to Ohio State Archaeological and Historical Society as a public park. It's a fabulous place if you ever get a chance to go there. And this is the drawing of the thing. And in some books, they mention a snake swallowing an egg. But we know today that it's much more likely that this Adena age serpent was disgorging something sacred, maybe the world actually in mythology. That makes more sense than a snake swallowing an egg. But anyway, radiocarbon dates show this construction to have been in about 313 BC, so really ancient. Another example, in the 1830s, the American artist George Catlin traveled throughout the Western US painting these iconic images of Indian tribes and their lifestyles. And Catlin became so concerned with the future status of the societies that he visited and the lifestyles that they represented that he proposed a large national park covering a very, very large area of this, what's now the central states of the United States, to preserve the bison and the Indian tribes dependent on them for survival. And the reason he did this was he saw the rapid decline in both the bison population and the native people who were dependent on them, and was very, very concerned that their survival they couldn't survive unless somebody set aside this giant landscape so that they could survive in there and their culture could thrive. And he made a serious proposal to do this, um, citing what a beautiful and thrilling specimen for America to preserve and hold up to the view of her refined citizens and the world in future ages. A nation's park containing man and beast, all in the wild and freshness of their nature's beauty. This was his proposal in 1841. So this is before Yellowstone, which was 1872. It was a serious proposal, but unfortunately, well, it never happened. But the first national park could have been a cultural park. Um, so moving on, Navajo National Monument, 1909, President William H. Taft established National Monument. John Wetherell was appointed the first superintendent with a stipend, a salary of $1 a month. This was a huge area. It's since been broken up into different types of management categories. Jamestown, the first English colony in North America, 1607. In 1893, the first 22 acres acquired by Preservation Virginia, and so on and so on. National Parks takes over management of the adjacent parcels in the 1940s. So each state has a bit of a different approach to how to incorporate historic preservation within a park concept, and it varies from place to place. Gettysburg Battlefield is another one. The Civil War Memorial from 1863. Of course, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. In 1895, Gettysburg becomes a national military park managed by the War Department. And ultimately, in 1933, it's transferred to the National Park Service. So looking beyond the US to a few of my favorite places, La Isabela Historica, the first Spanish colony in the New World, founded by Columbus in 1493 on his second voyage on the north coast of Hispaniola. It becomes the capital of the New World, but it wasn't a real good place for a capital, and the capital was moved to Santo Domingo after a few years. Isabela falls into abandonment. And it wasn't until 1893 at the Columbian Exhibition and World's Fair, the 400th anniversary and the peak of Columbus's popularity, that La Isabela was recognized as a real important place in world history. So it was excavated in the 1980s and 1990s to discover the details of the original colony, its layout, its landscape, its interaction with native people, and so on. And in 2018, it has now been proposed for UNESCO World Heritage Site status. So that's La Isabela. It's a place of haunting beauty where the two worlds collided and the world itself was changed forever. Another one of my favorite historic sites in the Dominican Republic is this place called San Nicolas de Bari, the first hospital in the New World in the capital of Santo Domingo. Construction began in 1503. It's preserved today in the 20th century from the 20th century times as a monument to the colonial era in Santo Domingo. It combined a hospital and a chapel, as was typical with medieval hospitals at the time, so that they could treat you with faith, they could treat you with medicine. But it stands and it's one of the most popular historic sites in the capital of Santo Domingo. And then, of course, moving over to Mexico, Teotihuacan, the largest city in ancient America, for 5 centuries. 200 AD, the Pyramid of the Sun is constructed. 378 AD, the conquest of Tikal by peoples from Teotihuacan. This is an unbelievably iconic place and really something extraordinary. It's the most popular historic site in Mexico, and the site was first expropriated for the national patrimony under the Law of Monuments in 1897. In 1987, Teotihuacan was accepted as a World Heritage Site. Here's the Pyramid of the Moon and the Pyramid of the Sun. Pyramid of the Sun is thought to have been constructed around 200 AD, and it is calculated to be the third largest ceremonial structure in the world. Only the Great Pyramid of Cholula and the Great Pyramid of Giza are larger than the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan. I don't know if you can see that, but those are people up here. These little guys, these little ants, those are people there. So back to parks. So I guess my point here is that although Ken Burns talks about the park concept as America's greatest idea, in truth, that idea was spread very rapidly around the Western Hemisphere, and people decided that these historic places had value that needed protection and preservation as part of a national patrimony. So when I look back at the justification for California state parks, I found something very, very interesting. To me, at least, it was interesting. The natural and scenic parks are described as having beauty, recreation, preserving fragile nature, the older ones countering the greed of the rich. They all are described as having intrinsic value. When I looked at the history or the heritage parks, the justification was for patriotism, education, understanding human progress, antiquity and diversity, recognizing accomplishments and mistakes of earlier generations. So it's a kind of an interesting concept. The natural parks are thought to have intrinsic value, whereas the cultural sites, the cultural landscapes, are having the potential. The potential is there for education and understanding human progress, not necessarily involved in the intrinsic value of that landscape itself. I'm not sure if I'm explaining this well enough, but I found a little bit of a difference there. And that made me kind of perk up because I thought, wow, I don't feel that way. I feel these cultural properties have every bit as much intrinsic value as any other landscapes we have in the state park system. I defy anyone to walk through the cemetery of the Russian colony at Fort Ross, for example, and not feel the intrinsic value there. Or to go to the stone fish trap sites at Ajimali Lava Springs State Park and not feel the intrinsic value of that construction for the purpose not simply to catch fish, but to manage a fishery. So that's pretty important. You cannot possibly go to Bodie State Historic Park without seeing intrinsic value there. And I would argue the same is true or Colonel Allensworth or Chaussee or Duncan's Landing, where we've been at SAS. I remember when we were doing the excavation for at Colonel Allensworth for the first Baptist church, this structure here that was reconstructed. And when we did the excavations behind the church, we uncovered the baptismal pool back there. And one of our volunteer excavators and helpers on that project was an aged minister, Baptist minister. And when he saw this baptismal pool uncovered, he teared up and he just could not help himself. So you can't tell me that these cultural landscapes don't also have intrinsic value. They certainly do. They certainly absolutely do. Okay, the next giant I want to mention is a man named Vernon Aubrey Neesham, mostly called Aubrey Neesham. He was born 1908 in Reno, Nevada. He enrolled at Berkeley in 1926 and finished there in 1936 with his PhD in history. He made a career as an experienced historian, writer, educator, and champion of historic preservation causes. He researched and promoted numerous historic sites spanning the Western United States throughout his life, leaving an indelible mark on such prominent sites as Old Sacramento, Columbia, Monterey, and Coloma. Now, he worked as the historian for the western part of the National Park System from 1936 to 1953. Santa Fe was his first office, and then he moved to San Francisco in that time. And after 1953, he took a job as the state historian for the state of California and worked for what was then called the Division of Beaches and Parks, today California State Parks, from 1953 to 1960. And then in 1964, he became a professor of park management at Sacramento State College. So many of the park managers that I dealt with in my time in state parks had graduated from Sac State in the park management program there, of which Aubrey Neesham had been a professor. So I heard a lot about Aubrey Neesham, even though I really never met him, and he wasn't around when I started in 1975. Anyway, I want to read something that Aubrey Neesham left us. He died in 1982, and in a few years after that, his family was going through his desk, and they found a letter dated February 3rd, 1961. A letter to a future generation. Dear children of the future, this is 1961. You who will read this, say in 2061, will know a world much different from ours of today. Ours has vastly changed from that of our grandparents. During the last 100 years, America has progressed from the horse and buggy days through the building of the transcontinental telegraph and railroad, the automobile, the airplane, and recently into what we think is the wonderful age of radio, television, and space-age rocketry, among other miracles of science. We have been pioneers, we think, opening up the doors to a world which will be yours. And yet, all that we have been able to do was made possible by the vision, the work, the faith, and the courage of earlier pioneers. What we are and what we have today were made possible only by those who came before us. We hope that what we are doing will make it possible for you to push forward new frontiers, Kennedy era phrase, all of which will make this a happier world in which to live. Some of us have been fighting a battle to save the important landmarks of the past, those remains of our heritage which represent the work and deeds of earlier generations. Sometimes it has been difficult because of the demands of a growing population with all of its expanded need for housing, schools, highways, and many forms of construction. On occasion, we have allowed priceless and fragile representatives of our heritage to disappear, all in the name of progress and economic necessity. At times, lack of appreciation, carelessness, and what is worse, inertia, have been the destroyers of what should have been considered as precious. We cannot keep faith with you if we allow what is rightfully yours to disappear. Here in Sacramento, the capital city of California, a freeway has been proposed, which, if constructed, will go through the heart of the original Old Sacramento. This area represents a vital part of the foundations of California. Gold Rush, Pony Express, Transcontinental Railroad, these and many other facets of our colorful beginnings are represented in the buildings and sites which are located there. Those of us who are holding the line against the destructive forces which, if unsuccessful, will not allow you to see and visit the great sites of history, will not easily give in. In fairness to you, we cannot. Although many will say that we will not be here to face your scorn and contempt if we destroy your birthright, I, for one, do not believe a majority of the present generation thinks in these terms. Most of us recognize our obligation to you. We want you to think kindly of our efforts to make yours a better place in which to live. And so we shall keep fighting to protect what is rightfully yours to use and enjoy. Should we lose in our efforts, and I cannot think we will, please know that throughout the thousands of years in which mankind has progressed, this same process has been going on. There have been those who have had the courage to think and act beyond the needs of the immediate present. Had there not been these, we would not be where we are today, nor you where you will be in the year 2061. In closing, whatever happens in Sacramento and the countless other communities in California and our nation, you in 2061 will have a better idea of what was right and what was wrong with the thoughts and actions of those who lived in 1961. We hope you will believe that those who tried to save your heritage were on the right track. At least you will know they had the courage to attempt to hold the line. Perhaps this is the most important thing. After all, to hold a line against those who would try to tear down that which made America great is fundamental. This principle is of utmost concern to our generation. I'm sure it will be to yours as well. V. Aubrey Nisham. Really, it's amazing. February 3rd, 1961, his family found this letter sealed in an envelope in his desk. And when you read it today, it's just amazing. So how did that Sacramento thing work out anyway? Well, by golly, Aubrey Nisham managed to get highways to bend that freeway around Old Sacramento and preserve the core area of what is now Old Sacramento State Historic Park. So well done, Aubrey Nisham. I'll just summarize Aubrey Nisham's contributions real briefly. He made an indelible imprint on most of the iconic historic historic parks we have in California, and he established a lot of standards which were to emerge in subsequent decades in terms of historic preservation. One of the most important that Nisham developed was what he called preservation in use, what we call adaptive use today for historic structures. And the reason this was important was because Olmsted Jr.'s concept of a historic park was a sealed landscape that was not used but preserved intact and treated as a little piece of frozen history in time, so that you would have um, costume rangers or whatever involved in showing people what it was like in the old days. Excuse me. Um, Nisham changed that with this concept of adaptive use of historic structures and landscapes. And Parks has been very successful in adapting this Nisham concept across our system at Asilomar, at Crystal Cove, at many, many different sites. And so this is another lasting contribution of Aubrey Nisham. And then turning to our last giant of the day, Francis A. Riddell. I was so lucky when I came to state parks in 1975 because I was appointed Fritz Riddell's assistant. And I got to work with him for years. I got to travel with him frequently. And he was really a fantastic person for cultural resources and for state parks. You couldn't have had a better advocate, and I could not have had a better mentor or teacher than Francis A. Riddell. Um, Fritz grew up in Susanville and became very familiar with the native peoples and the sites of that area of California. Um, he he went to Sacramento City College in 1936 and studied under J.B. Lillard and Robert Heiser with under J.B. Lillard with Robert Heiser and Franklin Fennenga. Went on to Berkeley for his BA and MA and became the first archaeologist appointed along with Franklin Fennenga to the UC Archaeological Survey from Berkeley. In 1954, Fritz became the curator of the State Indian Museum, and he became in 1958 the first archaeologist hired outside of a university position in all of Western North America, not just California. He was the first guy hired as a state archaeologist that was not part of a university. So this is really was quite a breakthrough for the state of California. He in the 60s and 70s, he was assigned to the largest and most complex development projects in California history, including the State Water Project and the highway projects, and so on and so forth. And this huge development, this huge emphasis on California's development, triggered a massive need for salvage archaeology during that period of, say, 20 years or so, with a huge emphasis on mitigation and planning work for park development. Fritz was the perfect guy to take this on. He was a problem solver. He was a motivator. He was a teacher. And he was also, in my experience, he was the best field archaeologist I ever saw. He could actually read a landscape. He knew what early people were doing there, and he just had a real knack for it. He'd studied it since he was a kid, and he couldn't wait to get involved in preserving these sites. And as I mentioned, he became the curator, the first professional curator, as it was in 1954 at the State Indian Museum. And he brought professional standards and policies to the management of collections. In his day, in the old state Indian museums, baskets covered the walls and rafters. They were just nailed in place and been up there for years. Well, he removed all those kinds of things. He actually built exhibits. He researched materials. He gave out new information and really put us on a path of doing a proper job with collections in California state parks, which remains an important aspect of cultural resources today. As I mentioned, there isn't anybody that ever met Fritz that doesn't remember him. He was a lively character, a fun guy to be around. He really, really made you feel great. And you could always learn something by talking to him. I mean, really, he was an extraordinary person. And I'm so lucky to have, been his assistant for years. Um, in the 1970s, as I mentioned, Fritz got involved in the State Water Project, actually in the 1960s. And if Gordon McGregor is watching today, he'll remember these shots of the construction of the dam at San Luis Reservoir. And this and other parts of the State Water Project were these massive constructions carried out in an area of California that was very, very little known in terms of its archaeology. Um, so Fritz was the perfect person to be hired to do these kinds of projects, and he basically invented the concept of public archaeology. Here's some here's some snapshots of the work from those days, and you can see the bleak hills and stuff that surrounded San Luis Creek there. Now, in Kroeber's book, The Indians of California, he didn't have much to say about the people on the west side of the San Joaquin Valley. It was basically an unknown. It was known to be a Yokuts territory, but in terms of its antiquity and population size and so on, there wasn't much known about it. But Kroeber suspected, because the drainages were relatively small and so on, that there wouldn't have been a real rich prehistory to be uncovered in that area. Well, Fritz proved that absolutely wrong in his excavations at San Luis Reservoir. This is an example of one of the structures that they uncovered, and I'm going to move through this just quickly. This is a huge, huge um, circular dance house structure, um, one of the largest, if not the largest, um, prehistoric structures known from California. And here's the plan of the excavations there. An incredible sized structure here. It's at the Mengele site, Merced 3, and measures 69 feet in diameter. This house pit, this ceremonial structural house pit, 69 feet in diameter. Well, here's the Great Kiva at Casa Rinconada in Chaco Canyon. This is the largest Great Kiva in the whole Southwest. It's 64 feet in diameter. So this structure that Fritz excavated at San Luis Reservoir is larger. It's another ceremonial structure. It's larger than the largest Great Kiva in the Southwest. So that's pretty amazing. Anyway, Fritz excavating a mammoth tusk at the base of the San Luis Dam. I threw this picture in uh, for Dennis so that he knows that the witch site's not all that far away. This was a bone that was found, a tusk that was found at the base of the San Luis Dam. So they dug down, I don't know how far, but very far, 30, 40 feet. Fritz and his assistant at the time, Bill Olson, were involved in a lot of the iconic excavations performed on behalf of the state of California. This one at the Governor's Mansion site in 1973. And at the time of his retirement, Fritz was recognized throughout the state as an unquestioned champion of Native Americans in California and the resources related to Native Americans. Um, Most significant has been your unswavering dedication to the cause of justice for Native Americans and the preservation of the remaining evidence of Native American societies wherever they are found in California. So this is our legacy left by Fritz Riddell, a fantastic person and somebody who really made a difference. Um, Fritz, Fritz's vision was that someday Native Californians will be studying their own heritage sites that we've protected within California state parks. And this has actually now come to pass. So it's really something that he saved these sites so that people can learn from them, including the descendants of the people that are related. So I want to read a little something about Fritz. I was going to tell a story, but there's a good story published on Fritz that kind of gives you an idea about him. Um, this is from Brian Dillon's article about Fritz Riddell. One of his proudest accomplishments, talking about Fritz, was helping the Honey Lake Maidu revive their annual bear dance in Janesville in the late 1970s. Fritz had been present at several bear dances decades earlier and had witnessed and extensively photographed one of the last performed in traditional fashion in the 1950s. He worked closely with the younger Maidu who wanted to hold the bear dance for the first time in almost 30 years and saw the project through to its completion. Fritz was so pleased and proud of this dangerously moribund tradition was alive again that he invited California Governor Jerry Brown to visit the first new performance of this ancient California Indian ritual. And to everybody's delight, the governor accepted. Unfortunately, the governor's motorcade was delayed, and the dancers, after waiting around for the big cheese hour after hour, decided to start the dance without him. Even worse, when the governor finally arrived, instead of moving over to the bear dance, he stayed by his car, hobnobbing with his aides, all of whom were pressing some form or other of urgent business upon him. When Fritz saw what was happening, he grabbed a spoonful of acorn mush, waded through the gubernatorial toadies, parting them like Moses at the Red Sea, and shoved the acorn mush into the governor's open mouth. This had the twin benefits of simultaneously getting the governor's attention and also shutting him up. Fritz then dragged Jerry Brown over to the circle of dancers, handed him a willow wand, telling him, "This bear's ready to dance, and he doesn't wait for anybody." After a decent interval, the governor fled back to Sacramento, convinced that he had barely escaped with his life from that state parks and recreation madman Riddell and his Indian allies. Well, I don't know that I was there. I don't know that I can vouch for every detail, but I was there at the dance circle. And when I looked over and saw the governor, I think he did have what looked like a little bit of oatmeal on his chin. So I'll leave you with that. Fritz Riddell, he's one of my real heroes and giants in the cultural resource in parks business. I don't want to leave you with the impression this was entirely a male enterprise. It certainly wasn't. There are a number of women who made important contributions along the line as we developed the state park system. And I'm remembering today Betty Jo Rivers, who worked with us for many years and was a fabulous, fabulous person, our editor, our heart and soul in the archaeology lab for decades. Here she is with me accepting the Governor's Historic Preservation Award in '92. And then Eloise Richards Barter, Associate State Archaeologist. I had the privilege of attending her 90th birthday party, I think it was last year. And so I'm remembering her today too. She did a fabulous job for us and was very, very much responsible for maintaining the standards that were set by some of the giants that came before us in our time. So, how are parks and cultural resources doing today? Well, I think we can say, and knowing Kroeber's advice to Olmsted, that the state park system today not only contains these iconic landscapes for which everyone immediately is drawn, such as I've shown here, Bodie and Hearst Castle and Chumash Painted Cave, but also um, it has incorporated a large number of other historic sites of different kinds within the broader range of acquisitions which have come in since Olmsted's time. And I think if you look at the statistics, you'll see that California leads the nation in terms of having the most state parks. There's the list there, the top 5. And most impressively, here's a list of the states with the most national and state parks in terms of park area as a percentage of the state land. So California has 9 national parks, and combined with the state park system, those represent 7.5% of the landmass of California. Only Alaska has more. They have 8 national parks and have a higher percentage of preserved parkland as a measure of their acreage. By contrast, there are a whole lot of states that rank at the very bottom. There's a real uh, grouping of them at the very bottom, including Kansas, Mississippi, Texas, Oklahoma, and Georgia. But I could list another 2 dozen, which are, and that's not necessarily their choice. If your state didn't get national park quality landscapes, then you're not going to have national parks there probably. So anyway, the bottom line here is that California, where the concept of parks began, has been very successful, not only on the national level, but particularly on the state level, where California's state park system is unmatched anywhere in the country. So what's happening today in terms of acquisitions? Well, the acquisition programs that we knew for decades that were funded by statewide bond measures have that era has kind of come to an end. But but that doesn't mean that we can't still add important acreage to the state park system. There can be specific allocations, but we have to also keep in mind that the state of California manages a vast area that is managed by the California State Lands Commission, the underwater areas of California. And that's where Kenny Kramer and I and a number of our predecessors, including Jim Barry and other people, have made a difference in bringing some of these iconic underwater parks into the system. This is an example, Emerald Bay. It became an underwater park in 1994. And most people looked at it and said, well, yes, that makes sense. Bring that into the state park system, because state park owns all the land, all the terrestrial areas surrounding Emerald Bay. So it only makes sense that the bay itself becomes a state park as well. But what we didn't realize that the submerged bottomland of Emerald Bay contains this vast array of cultural resources in the form of these boats and barges and vessels of the 19th century. And as we continue to study that submerged landscape, it's become more and more valuable and is now regarded as a place where some of the best preserved examples of recreational boats from the 19th century can be found. So anyway, other underwater parks areas capture other types of historical sites, including this F4U Corsair, ditched in 1949. And most recently, We celebrated the opening of the Emerald Bay Maritime Heritage Trail and had a live dive there, in which uh, an actual park interpreter hooked up with a live feed and a full face mask can be down there and describing some of these historic vessels on the bottom. And uh, our cameraman back there and our assistant back there is Kenny Kramer, who's watching today. So anyway, this is what's been happening lately. We have not stopped bringing these sites in. We're still continuing to look at other sites that could be brought in. This is an important one that was brought in, the Frolic shipwreck, an 1850 shipwreck. Um, it's one of the most important historic shipwrecks in the state. And so up there on the Mendocino coast, and now State Parks, which owns the terrestrial land here, has extended their ownership by lease from state lands to include the wreck of the Frolic. So the future, I believe there are going to be great opportunities to expand the underwater park areas in California. It's by far the cheapest way to add acreage to the state park system because we just get it transferred from the State Lands Commission. But in the future, I see a lot more cultural resource potential coming to fruition through the acquisition of underwater parks in California. So when I look at this image up here, I also see this image down here. Cultural resources are an integral part of the design, the history, and the planning in California state parks. And I think that will continue on into the future. And with that, I'm done. Thank you very much for listening.